It's really nice to have Ben Dunning back. He is professor of theology at Fordham University, where he teaches New Testament and early Christianity, as well as being on the affiliated faculty in comparative literature and in women's studies. He has been, since he left here, very busy. He graduated in 2005. In the meantime, he has produced 3 monographs. The first, Aliens and Sojourners, Self as Other in Early Christianity. The second, Specters of Paul, Sexual Difference in Early Christian Thought. And the third, the one about which he will speak to us this afternoon, is Christ Without Adam, Subjectivity and Sexual Difference in the Philosopher's Paul. There's also numerous essays and other things that Ben has published over the last few years, very exciting work on the intersections of early Christianity, early Christian theology, and contemporary theoretical and philosophical concerns. The book about which Ben is going to talk about today is, all of his work is exciting, but this book I'm particularly excited about. Christ Without Adam, Subjectivity and Difference in the Philosopher's Paul is exactly the kind of theoretically informed, empirically rich, and rigorous engagement with contemporary philosophy's entrancement with Paul that we very much need. The book, I think, is going to be the key intervention in contemporary discussions of Paul and of the reading of Paul as the site of a new universalism that is articulated in Stanislas Breton, in Alain Badiou, and in Slavoj Žižek. Dunning is interested, and he notes the way in which Paul is used to announce a putatively new universalism against the particularisms of identity politics. As he shows, and he'll talk about it today, I'm not going to give the whole game away, as he shows throughout the book, this universalism is hardly new, nor does it avoid the trap of previous claims to universalism, in which the particularities of human bodies are masked by a masculinized anthropology. And that's what I think is so enormously powerful about the book, is that Ben is able to show the ways in which the readings of Paul that appear in Breton, in Badiou, and in Žižek are symptomatic of a desire for universalism in which the demands of particular others might once again be effaced. The fact that there's a huge amount of academic excitement around these readings of Paul is one that gives me great political pause, and does Dunning as well. It's enormously refreshing in the midst of the often muddled discussions about Paul in contemporary discourse to encounter someone who both knows contemporary theory and knows the actual letters of Paul, and knows which ones he actually wrote and which ones he didn't, stuff like that, and the early Christian Pauline tradition. Yet Ben doesn't simply pose or oppose a scholar's Paul to a philosopher's Paul, but he shows how Breton, Badiou, and Žižek untether the Pauline event, which is the Christ event, but they don't like calling it the Christ event because that would mean they'd have to mention Christ, from its relationship to Genesis. And so through a sleight of hand, they can pretend that man means humanity and that the Son is not marked by sexual difference. All of which is to say, I think there's tremendous political import to Professor Dunning's work in this book, as in his last 2 books, and I very much look forward to the fallout and the responses that are generated by this particular reading of Paul that refuses that process of degendering universalization that we see in much contemporary theoretical work. So I will now allow Ben to talk about his own book instead of me talking about his book, and heartily join me in welcoming Ben Dunning. Please.
Amy, I think you took my talk. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to be back at HDS with friends and teachers, and I ran into one of my former students at Fordham in the hallway who's a master's student here now, and it's really, really great to be here. So the material I'm going to present tonight, as Amy mentioned, is drawn from the argument of my new monograph, which came out recently with Columbia, Christ Without Adam, Subjectivity and Sexual Difference in the Philosopher's Paul. And the basic Pauline problem that the book engages is this. Paul bequeathed to the history of Western thought a set of elaborate reflections on what it means to be a human being, enmeshed in, but never entirely determined by, the complexities of identification: social, ethnic, cultural, sexual. And here, as probably everyone in this room knows, there's perhaps no more famous statement than the rallying cry of Galatians 3:28, "In Christ there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female." And yet, as the convoluted interpretive history of this and other Pauline texts has shown, more often than not, it is not always entirely clear what precise anthropological point Paul is actually trying to make. Nor is it clear how a statement such as Galatians 3:28 should be taken together with other Pauline statements about the human condition with respect to God, Christ, sin, the world, and the exigencies of existence, if indeed we even should take these statements together at all. One thing does seem clear, though. Whatever anthropological claims Paul made in his letters, whether informed by an underlying systematic vision or simply comprised of ad hoc statements responding to specific crises, these claims were deeply aware of and thus concerned with the problems posed by the simple fact that human beings have bodies. These are bodies that both grow and decay, that endure in continuity with themselves and yet also undergo radical change, that function as the simultaneous site of limitation and possibility, and that, most fundamentally, are different from one another. Thus, Paul paid substantial attention to issues that attend the differences between bodies, issues ranging from circumcision to gender and desire. And while he did sometimes offer seemingly Platonizing formulations, contrasting the earthly tent of the body to higher heavenly realities, it has become increasingly clear, thanks to recent scholarship, that Paul didn't articulate a stereotypically Platonic position on human bodies overall. That is to say, he refused simply to write off the body as an incidental or burdensome accessory to the true human self. Rather, the apostle sought to situate the body as an ambiguous but nonetheless irreducible aspect of what it means to be human. Okay, so that's a few words on Paul. Obviously, there is much, much more that could be said. Now for philosophy. As I'm sure many of us in the room know, in recent years, the Pauline corpus has enjoyed a renewal of interest from an unlikely source: continental philosophy and critical theory. And so from outside the guilds of theology and biblical studies, thinkers such as Jacob Taubes, Alain Badiou, Giorgio Agamben, and Slavoj Žižek, to name only the most prominent, have turned to the apostle as a conceptual resource in order to theorize a variety of issues, including human subjectivity, universalism, political action, and temporality. This renewal has in turn begun to be engaged by scholars in biblical studies, philosophical theology, and the philosophy of religion. My entry point into this conversation comes by way of an interest in sex, gender, and sexuality in relation to the biblical text and its afterlives. Put most simply, given that Paul deals extensively with issues related to gender, embodiment, and desire in his authentic letters, how are we to understand the tendency of these recent philosophical readings to ignore or downplay this aspect of the apostle's thinking? If Paul is to function as a contemporary intellectual resource for theorizing a putative singular universal, in what ways are the different theories of the subject that emerge from this conversation shaped by or even dependent on this exclusion? And how might contemporary Christian theological anthropology interact with both the Pauline text and its modern philosophical interpreters in order to offer alternative accounts of an embodied, gendered Pauline subject? My starting point builds on where my previous book, Spectres of Paul, stopped, thinking about the Pauline Adam-Christ typology in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, and its uptake in representative philosophical readings of Paul. In Spectres of Paul, I argued that Paul's letters bequeathed a crucial anthropological aporia to the history of Christian thought, insofar as the apostle sought to situate embodied human beings typologically, with reference to two paradigmatic human beings, Adam and Christ, but failed to work out where sexual difference might fit within such a typology. As a result, the space between Adam and Christ has come to function historically as one of the places where the Christian tradition has struggled to work out its theological dilemmas around embodied difference. So turning now to these recent philosophical appropriations of Paul, I'm interested in how that problem is working, or not working, as the case may be, in representative readings by philosophers. And the three I focus on in the book are Stanislas Breton, Alain Badiou, and Slavoj Žižek. Put most basically, Paul's typology situates Adam as part of an unbreakable pair, Adam and Christ. In this way, he tethers the Christ event to the Genesis narrative, and he figures the relationship between the two in terms of Christ's recapitulative significance with regard to the first human being. But because in the respective biblical narratives, Adam is a man, just as Christ is a man, the Pauline link between Adam and Christ raises the question of where or how to situate Eve and sexual difference, a problem that was not only clearly visible, but indeed pressing to so many ancient readers of Paul, and that's what the other book is about. By contrast, in the Philosopher's reading, the Adam-Christ typology is refigured such that Adam plays no anthropologically significant role. That is to say, the so-called Paulinisms of Breton, Badiou, and Žižek all work either to sidestep or to collapse the typological and anthropological interval between Adam and Christ. The result, these readings either cannot see or simply refuse to see the force of the problem that so exercised early Christian thinking about Pauline typology. And their shared pursuit of a new universal ends up necessarily minimizing the significance of sexual difference. And as such, I argue, repeats in large part a very old gesture, one also employed by many late ancient Christians, seeking to domesticate bodily difference by relegating it to a place of ostensible stability or indifference that poses no threat to the terms of the larger subjective or anthropological system. Reading Paul's anthropology in terms of Christ without Adam works to render Eve's difference putatively incidental and thus effectively ignorable. And this, I argue, is a crucial move in propping up the problematic notion of the Pauline Christ as the paradigmatic singular universal. But the strategy employed by these contemporary thinkers to get there is distinctive. And it's my contention that we can see this distinctiveness most clearly by scrutinizing the role and or the absence of the figure of Adam as a typological paradigm in each reading of Paul. I thus maintain that there is a significant, if not necessarily conscious or intentional alignment between, on the one hand, the move to expunge, minimize, or otherwise redirect the anthropological particularity and import of the figure of Adam, and on the other hand, the failure of sexual difference to materialize, in all three of these readings, as a question with any kind of explicit or acknowledged force, one that might trouble the Pauline subjectivities being propounded. So how does this work? One argument of the book is that it works differently in each of the three, Breton, Badiou, and Žižek. I have another version of this talk where I kind of go through each one of them, and they're all kind of complicated, but Professor King had asked me specifically to save some time to talk about the constructive conclusions of the final chapter of the book. So in order to give space to that, I am only going to give you one example, and that'll be from Žižek. So, Slavoj Žižek. If you have never read him, he can be fun, he can be frustrating, he is quite often infuriating all at once, but reading him is an experience. You should try it if you never have. Žižek's interaction with Paul begins as a reading and critique of Alain Badiou's book on Paul, The Foundation of Universalism. And Žižek undertakes this critique in The Ticklish Subject in 1999. Since then, he's proceeded to develop his own quite distinctive reading of both Paul and Christian theology more broadly in books such as The Fragile Absolute, The Puppet and the Dwarf, and with John Milbank, The Monstrosity of Christ. In the interests of time, I'm going to focus primarily on later work and the interpretive steps, often quite rhetorically dazzling, by which Žižek situates Pauline typology within his larger reading of the apostle as a whole. So to summarize a rather complicated argument fairly briefly, the central issue that Žižek is interested in, he finds in Romans 7. And here he builds on a famous reading of Romans 7 offered by Jacques Lacan in the 7th seminar. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the Romans passage, but let me just read a little from the NRSV so it's kind of out there with us. What then should we say? That the law is sin? By no means. If it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good." That, of course, is Romans 7 to 12. As Zizek reads it, what is at issue in this famous passage from Romans is the problem of perversion. And here he means the term perversion in a very specific technical sense, which is that the law, by its act of prohibition, gives rise to the desire for its own infringement, that is, sin, and necessarily so, insofar as the transgression shores up and intensifies the force of the law qua law. For Zizek, this is the preeminent problem of Pauline theology. The law splits the subject, bringing muddle and confusion into the distinction between the sphere of life and that of death. The perverse result is that desire, a force which ought to be considered constitutive of life, comes to be seen instead as a foreign body, that is, as sin, leading compulsively down its own morbid path in opposition to the obedience of the conscious subject. How to interrupt, unplug, or otherwise break out of this cycle, how to engender a different relationship to one's own desire, this is the whole Pauline project for Zizek. So the issue on the table, most basically, a law that has built in the necessity of its own transgression through the incitement of desire, or what Zizek calls the hidden perverse core of Christianity. And he offers two additional biblical examples. The first one would be God's own perversity in the Genesis narrative. So reading the divine creation of the prohibition not to eat from the tree as a strategic move, one that necessarily leads human beings to fall in order that God can then step in and save them. And then he reads similarly Judas's putative betrayal of Jesus, right? That at one and the same time, this is condemned as the height of transgression, and yet it's absolutely necessary to the fulfillment of the divine plan, thereby rendering Judas heroic in his willingness to accept damnation in order to play a part that both God and Christ seemingly need. And people react differently to this depending on what sort of audiences I'm in when I presented this. But it's worth noting that I have all kinds of critiques of Zizek, and you're about to hear them. But on that particular point that I just laid out, it's worth noting that I've noticed again and again with my own students at Fordham, undergrads, if they haven't been raised in the stories and traditions of the Bible, of Christianity, and you just read them, you just read Genesis, you just read the Gospels, they go right there. They go right to that point. I mean, it's like the first thing they notice is that something seems off here around this question of what Zizek is calling perversity. So how to break out of this perverse logic at the core of the Christian narrative? In Zizek's own language, is it possible to read the relationship between Judas and Christ in a different way outside this perverse economy? Or in a parallel vein, is it possible to read the seemingly perverse relationship between creation, fall, and redemption differently? So, where does Zizek turn for this? He turns actually to Hegel. This gets more complicated than I can get into here. But the basic idea is that Zizek uses a Hegelian logic to offer a rereading of the fall as always already its own sublation, that the fall contains within itself the seeds of redemption. And indeed, the passage to redemption is nothing more than a radicalization of the logic of the fall, the lower stage at once negated and preserved in the higher possibility. In Zizek's own words, quote, "Here we have the properly Hegelian matrix of development. The fall is in itself already its own self-sublation. The wound is in itself already its own healing, so that the perception that we are dealing with the fall is ultimately a misperception, an effect of our distorted perspective." The problem then is fundamentally about misrecognition, not about humanity's metaphysical plummet into a discrete place or state, as the spatial metaphor of fall might seem to imply. And Zizek says this explicitly. He says, there's no place from which we have fallen. Thus, what is needed is not a radical overcoming of the fall, which would be figured in that sense as the polar opposite of Christ's redemption, but rather a shift in one's point of view, or as Zizek puts it, a shift in our subjective position. Can we avoid the perversity of this misrecognition? In Zizek's view, there is only one way, quote, to insist on the absolute identity of the two gestures. God does not first push us into sin in order to create the need for salvation, and then offer himself as the redeemer from the trouble into which he got us in the first place. It is not that the fall is followed by redemption. The fall is identical to redemption. It is in itself already redemption, end quote. It is in this shift in perspective, this construal of both fall and redemption as an identical explosion of freedom seen from different angles, that Zizek sees the political possibilities of the Pauline moment, possibilities that are both vulnerable and fleeting and simultaneously potent and revolutionary. But thus far, he has not grounded such a reading concretely in the Pauline text. And this, then, is the problem that Zizek uses the Adam-Christ typology to solve. He therefore turns to Adam and Christ as paradigmatic figures and frames his reading of them in terms of the point that I just laid out, the identity of fall and redemption. So, quoting him, the properly Christian redemption is not simply the undoing of the fall, but strictly speaking, its repetition. The key to St. Paul's theology is repetition. Christ as the redemptive repetition of Adam. Adam has fallen, Christ has risen again. Christ is therefore the last Adam, 1 Corinthians 15, 45 to 49. Through Adam, as sons of Adam, we are lost, condemned to sin and suffering. Through Christ, we are redeemed. Thus, what Zizek takes to be most fundamental about the typology is the notion of repetition. But crucially, by situating the Adam-Christ typology as he does within his larger argument, he manages to pull Paul's distinctly typological sense of repetition, that is, repetition as an irreducible interplay of similarity and identity on the one hand and contrast, difference, and rupture on the other. He pulls that into a new philosophical register, which is this his peculiarly Hegelian notion of repetition that I've just been laying out. And furthermore, although he cites 1 Corinthians 15, the point seems governed by Romans 5, insofar as the concrete concerns with anthropology and embodiment, which characterize the Corinthian passage, are completely ignored. On this reading, then, the Adam-Christ typology comes to support Zizek's contention regarding the identity of fall and redemption. Quote, it is not that things went wrong downhill first with Adam and were then restored with Christ. Rather, and this is the key point, Adam and Christ are one and the same. Christ is Adam, perhaps the ultimate speculative judgment. All that changes in order for us to pass from one to the other is perspective, end quote. Elaborating the point further in technical Hegelian language, quote, Adam is Christ in itself, and Christ's redemption is not the negation of the fall, but its accomplishment in exactly the same sense that, according to St. Paul, Christ accomplishes the law, end quote. And there's the tie-in back to the Romans 7 problem. Thus, in what would appear to be an interpretive tour de force, Zizek brings together the various and seemingly disparate strands of argument he has been developing into a tightly drawn unity. Insofar as the apostle's Adam is Christ, then both the identity of fall and redemption and the Pauline suspension of the investment in the perversity of the law point towards the possibility of imagining Christianity otherwise, beyond the perverse forms in which we have come to know it. So that's Zizek's argument in a nutshell, admittedly a bit simplified, but that's the basic idea. And now for my response. I want to suggest that the elegant Hegelian unity of this reading in fact imposes a stranglehold on the Pauline text, one that stifles and ultimately suppresses its anthropological distinctives in the service of a different project. On the one hand, Zizek recognizes that there is something fundamentally anthropological about the Adam-Christ typology, that it has profound implications for Paul's theology of human beings more broadly. And he's actually the only one of the three who recognizes that. The other two have ways of just sort of making Adam completely unimportant in their readings. That's where the title of the book comes from. What Zizek's doing is a little more complicated. On the other hand, though, what Zizek's reading misses, or more precisely collapses, is the opening for anthropological negotiation that the Adam-Christ typology creates, the interval in which the question of what it means to be an embodied human being, or, to be purposely anachronistic, a subject, poised tenuously between creation and resurrection, the interval in which that question presses for an answer, or at least for a serious engagement. Why this disregard for the force of an anthropological problematic that has exercised so many of Paul's other readers throughout the history of Christianity? Most straightforwardly, Zizek's reading pulls the discussion away from theological anthropology, repurposing Paul's reflections on Adam and Christ in the service of a different problem, perversity and the dilemma of a law that generates the desire for its own transgression. But I also want to suggest that Zizek is not especially concerned with these anthropological questions because he already has a vision of the subject worked out in another way, one that, I should note, despite getting there by a different route, is very much aligned with Badiou's. And here he turns, not surprisingly, to Galatians 3:28, which he reads as follows. Quote, "The key dimension of Paul's gesture is thus his break with any form of communitarianism. His universe is no longer that of the multitude of groups that want to," these are his scare quotes, "quote unquote, find their voice and assert their particular identity, their quote unquote way of life, but rather that of a fighting collective grounded in the reference to an unconditional universalism." So here, in a point that it sounds like it could come right out of Badiou's own book on Paul, if folks know that, the radical break brought about by the event renders inoperative the particularistic concerns of identity politics. And yet, while such a pointed and here somewhat unnecessary, or I find it unnecessarily sarcastic conclusion may have a certain coherence within Zizek's peculiarly Lacanian Hegelian way of reading Paul, its implications also reverberate backwards onto the interpretation of Adam and Christ that supports it. Thus, with respect to anthropology, or what we could call a theory of the subject, Christ is figured as, quote, "the man without properties, with no distinctions, no particular features, a singular universal." That is, the paradigm of the universal subject. And Adam's particularity, insofar as in Zizek's perspective, he, quote unquote, is Christ, matters not at all. So it should come as no surprise that in The Puppet and the Dwarf, Eve appears as no more than Adam's incidental companion in the drama of God's perversity at creation. Quote, "Why did God put the tree of knowledge there in the first place? Is it not that this was part of his perverse strategy, first to seduce Adam and Eve into the fall, then in order to save them? By collapsing the interval between the two paradigmatic humans, Adam and Christ, so that it doesn't function as a space, both temporal and conceptual, of anthropological negotiation, Zizek's reading renders the problematic of sexual difference that haunts that space, as figured in the character of Eve, seemingly indifferent or inoperative. But to do so involves effacing or recasting the actual anthropological particularities of the Pauline text with respect both to Christ and most especially to Adam. Thus might we not read the Adam-Christ typology in this instance as a point of textual resistance to Zizek's Paulinism, a stubborn and not easily erased attestation to, this is actually quoting Amy from a great article she wrote critiquing Zizek on some related issues. So not easily erased attestation to, quote, "the critical difference that difference, religious, ethnic, and most pointedly perhaps sexual, continues to make," end quote. All right, so in concluding my analysis of Zizek, before I move on to my own sort of constructive stuff on this, I want to point out a somewhat different note that he sounds in an earlier book, The Fragile Absolute from 2000. So this is from that text. He says, "As every true Christian knows, love is the work of love, the hard and arduous work of repeated uncoupling, in which again and again we have to disengage ourselves from the inertia that constrains us to identify with the particular order we were born into. And this unplugging, this vigorous and difficult work of love, quote, necessarily leads to the creation of an alternative community. So the alternative community Zizek has in mind, of course, is the one that we've already encountered, a new kind of militant collective cutting across identitarian differences and identity politics by reference to the Christian or Pauline universal of love beyond the law. Yet in this particular discussion, Zizek offers the following intriguing comment in passing. Quote, through the Christian work of compassionate love, we discern in what was hitherto a disturbing foreign body, tolerated and even moderately supported by us so that we were not too bothered by it, we discern a subject with its crushed dreams and desires, end quote. Now, what interests me about this is that it's a point about recognition, and even, I would suggest, anthropological recognition. That shift wherein an alien and disconcerting otherness might come in the messiness of its dreams and desires to figure within and thereby potentially change what constitutes the human as such. Yet indeed could this recognition ever arrive by means of a Pauline universal love that causes all anthropological differences to become indifferent, as Zizek speculates? Or does this understanding of universal love presuppose a tacit anthropology, an already determined concept of what frames the human that renders such recognition impossible, precisely because it would trouble the closed fixity of the anthropological frame on which the universal depends? In a debate with Zizek and Ernesto Laclau, Judith Butler makes the following observation in the context of her own quite different reading of Hegel. Quote, those who are dispossessed or remain radically unrepresented by the general will or the universal do not rise to the level of the recognizably human within its terms, end quote. This is a philosophical problem, I would argue, that has haunted Christian theological anthropology from antiquity to the present day. And we can see this problem acutely and urgently foregrounded in the aporias of the Pauline Adam-Christ typology. So as I've tried to show this afternoon, Zizek's reading of Paul makes this typology about something else, and in the process wrests it out of the sphere of theological anthropology. If Adam is Christ, then the anthropological interval is collapsed, and its attendant dilemmas of embodied difference are seemingly effaced. And yet, this is really not any kind of answer to the problem posed by Butler. In fact, she makes a pointed observation in the context of debating Zizek that seems equally applicable to his reading of Paulinism. Quote, the problem with Zizek's counterposition, as I understand it, is this. He does not return to the problem of the unrepresented within the field of representation. And so his response produces the appearance that this serious political problem simply does not interest him, end quote. And indeed, Zizek's sarcastic polemics against the self-indulgent vagaries and capitalist complicities of identity politics would seem to confirm this point. He is simply not that interested in the fundamental anthropological problem of the unrepresented and unrepresentable within the field of the human. And consequently, he harnesses the Adam-Christ typology to do other kinds of work. But as I have endeavored to argue, the philosophical readings of Paul put forward not only by Zizek, but also by Breton and Badiou, all to varying degrees, have to minimize, pass over, or otherwise redirect the textual complexities of Paul's speculations on the situation of embodied human beings in between Adam and Christ. In contrast, and indeed opposition to these readings, while still acknowledging occasional points of affinity, I want to wager that the Adam-Christ typology remains one of the most significant Pauline constructs for thinking through contemporary formulations of theological anthropology, both with and against Paul. So now to sort of move in the last part of the talk, this is the constructive stuff from the end of the book that Professor King asked me to speak about. So my reading of Zizek's treatment of the Adam-Christ typology raises questions about the basis for theological identification with Adam and Christ as paradigmatic figures, and more specifically, about whether or not the sexing of bodies is a crucial factor in the negotiation of that identification. To offer a straightforward answer to the latter question, the fact that in the history of the Christian tradition, the place of Eve in the typology emerges as a persistent question over and over again suggests that sexual difference is significant in this respect. In contrast to Zizek, whatever identification or solidarity with Christ or with Adam might have meant to Christian thinkers historically, many of them found that the problems posed by the sexed body could not be ignored. And this is, again, the problem that Spectres of Paul looks at historically, and I don't want to sort of give you a big, long summary of that book, but one thing that book focuses on is identifying two kind of basic strategies that 2nd and 3rd century Christians used to deal with this issue of where do you put Eve in relation to the Adam-Christ typology. And one is a more sort of Platonizing solution that we see all over the place, but Clement of Alexandria is kind of paradigmatic here, to treat the feminine as just a problem, right? I mean, just a kind of a temporary aberration that is going to have to be resolved at the eschaton one way or another, and he ends up backing himself into some really interesting but completely incoherent places in making this case. And then the other sort of major strategy that the book looks at is one that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries I would associate primarily with Irenaeus and Tertullian, which is about you build onto the typology, right? So you start with Adam and Christ, and then you build another layer for Eve and Mary, and it's all these very complicated speculations about virginity and flesh and what they have to do with each other, and it's fascinating stuff. But the typology of the feminine is always subordinate in those readings, and I don't have the time to get into it today, but what the other book argues is that in all of these cases, these ancient Christian thinkers fail to sort of coherently solve the problem they're trying to solve in terms internal to their own arguments. So the ancient tradition, I think, points to the conclusion that there has not been, and indeed cannot be, a definitive and fully coherent solution to the problem of situating embodied sexual difference within the Pauline Adam-Christ typology. Here, Marcella Althaus-Reid points to what for me is a very telling alignment. Quote, "Decent theologies struggle for coherence, the coherence that sexual systems also struggle for. Yet we may ask, what is wrong with being incoherent theologically?" End quote. The witness of the early Christian thinkers suggests that at least with respect to the entanglement of embodied subjectivity, sexual difference, and the Adam-Christ typology, such incoherence cannot be avoided. But turning to a constructive register, I want to suggest that this failure to fully resolve the gendered aporias of Paul's typology is not the kind of failure that needs to be denounced or moved beyond. Rather, it's more like the kind of failure Jacqueline Rose talks about when she states, "There is no stability of sexual identity, no position for women or for men, which is ever simply achieved. This failure is not a moment to be regretted in a process of adaptation or development into normality. Instead, failure is something endlessly repeated and relived moment by moment throughout our individual histories." Thus, constructive theological anthropology, I argue, ought not to turn away from this necessary failure, but instead intensify and radicalize its force. A project that has implications not only for the placement of feminine or female sexual difference, so often construed in androcentric and misogynistic ways by Christian thinkers in the early tradition, but I want to suggest that this has implications for the theological instability of all sexual subject positions. That is to say, I'm interested in the points at which the seamless, coherent operation of the Pauline typological and anthropological machine stumbles, thereby calling into question not only the place of feminine difference, but also the theological stability of male bodies, masculinity, and by extension, the very operation of the machine itself. What we see in the historical tradition, early Christian attempts to situate sexual difference within Pauline typology never fully domesticate or resolve such difference coherently, but they also, and this is really the crucial point, they never render it fully invisible. So we're talking not solely about Eve's absence in these systems, but also and always her shadowy, unstable presence. These later theological glosses on the Adam-Christ typology only partially succeed in covering over the trace of what they exclude. And this trace has a destabilizing effect, not merely with respect to the question of femininity, but rather with respect to the comprehensive anthropological aspirations of the system as a whole. And as I argue in the book, but don't have time to develop here, there are reasons to think that we might even see hints of this dynamic in the Pauline text itself, and in fact, in that favorite passage of Zizek's, Romans 7:7-25. There's a striking moment in Stanislas Breton's book on Paul, which I haven't talked about this afternoon, where he offers the following, quote, "Let us first ask how Paul himself lives and thinks his faith. He lives and thinks it as movement and affirmation. He lives and thinks it as movement and affirmation," end quote. So while I find myself considerably less optimistic than Breton that such a sentiment does in fact describe the conscious and intentional thrust of the apostles' thought, especially with respect to the domain of theological anthropology, nonetheless, I want to propose that the impossibility that sexual difference poses for Pauline typology opens a space of theological possibility, one that we indeed might characterize in terms of movement and affirmation. So what then of sexual difference and its ongoing place in Christian anthropology? To continue in conversation with the Pauline Adam-Christ typology is to work with reference to a system in which the normative status of the masculine is taken for granted, and its binary other, the feminine, is figured as a problem to be solved, whether that solution entails its refusal, eradication, or subordination. As such, and I want to be very clear about this, because sometimes I take it for granted and then people hear me saying something really different than I think I'm saying. So as such, the Adam-Christ typology is a problematic theological construct, and I do not think it can be recuperated or recovered in any simple or straightforward sense. And yet, attending to the diverse and complicated ways that various iterations of this anthropological machine remain haunted by Eve, right? That is, by a difference that the system can never fully put to rest, that this points to the irreducible inadequacy of treating Adam and Christ's masculinity alone, or even with the addition of even Mary's femininity, that these are inadequate as the paradigm for a mode of human identification that is stable, coherent, and all-encompassing while remaining embodied. In this way, rendering visible the system's own necessary breakdowns on terms internal to itself throws the very notion of sexual difference, femininity and masculinity, into crisis, or rather shows that it was always already in crisis. Now, acknowledgement of this crisis, which is really a crisis of coherence, does not necessarily usher in a space of sexual utopia in which the binary logic of masculinity and femininity is discarded wholesale, a genderqueer version of total and radical newness, a la the Baudouin or Zizekian event. And there's queer theology that's moving in this direction in one way or another. I think I'm doing something different here. But it does suggest and even demand that we wrestle with possibilities for thinking subjectivity and bodily difference otherwise. Or as Adam Phillips notes in conversation with Butler in The Psychic Life of Power, it may be more useful to talk about gradations and blurring rather than contours and outlines when we plot our stories about gender, keeping definition on the move, which is where it is anyway, end quote. My argument, then, is that contemporary theology's anthropological formulations need to be imbued with precisely this sense of definition on the move, and that the failures of the tradition to resolve the Adam-Christ typology's aporias coherently can and should function as a persistent theological goad towards that end. The gendered subject positions made available, or not available, literally unthinkable, and thus unrecognizable by the terms of the Adam-Christ typology, are an inescapable part of the Christian tradition's historical legacy. and yet their failures to cohere can be thought through in ways that yield new spaces of anthropological openness. What is at issue is most fundamentally about the building blocks by which anthropological recognition becomes possible in the first place. And this project takes on a special urgency in Christian contexts, still ongoing, as I'm sure we all know, where some are inclined to construe any queer proliferation of sex, gender, and the embodied structures of desire in, at best, self-indulgent, or at worst, sinful and unnatural terms. Such projects are driven at their core by what Butler calls a normative aspiration that has to do with the ability to live and breathe and move, and would no doubt belong somewhere in what is called a philosophy of freedom. The thought of a possible life is only indulgence for those who already know themselves to be possible. For those who are still looking to become possible, possibility is a necessity, end quote. In terms of the constructive project of the book, I'm particularly concerned about theological positions that would relegate the failure to embody idealized binary gender norms fully and perfectly to a symptom of humanity's fallen state, one that will be put right once and for all at the redemptive resolution of the eschaton. There are a million examples of this. In the scholarly world, Richard Hayes is probably the most prominent example of someone that whose arguments are very much still in a certain kind of scholarly mainstream and is making this kind of argument. More sophisticated versions of this theological position can in principle even accept Butler's argument that non-normative gender performances illuminate the ways in which no gender performance can do more than approximate the ideal, thereby revealing gender to be what she calls a norm that can never be fully internalized by anyone. And so there's these Christian theological positions that will go that far, right? But then by appeal to a Christian narrative of fall, sin, and eventual deliverance, such positions follow Butler up to a point while still looking ahead to a notion of redemption that would eschatologically fix it, right? That would shore up ideal, stable, and mutually exclusive forms of masculinity and femininity. And this is where I think my insistence on interrogating the specific terms of the Adam-Christ typology takes on a particular urgency. Unlike the familiar statements in the Pauline corpus that seem to be straightforwardly about the ideals of gender at some particular moment in the salvation historical narrative, and that's where we tend to have these fights theologically, right? At least in biblical studies, is around those passages. So unlike that, the Adam-Christ typology traverses and encompasses the full span of these various moments: creation, fall, and redemptive eschaton. So my point then is that the very terms by which the typological frame, inclusive of redemption, seeks to situate sexual subjectivity are not coherent and never were. Thus, a simple appeal to the mysteries of an eventual eschatological resolution that is somehow imagined to be coherent fails to produce a theologically viable solution. Rather, this sort of move only ends up short-circuiting or sidestepping the force of the anthropological dilemma posed by Paul's typology. In this way, the complexity of sexual subjectivity in view, complexity, I argue, that has always attended Christian theological speculation on what it means to be human, that this complexity is one that the androcentric terms of Paul's Adam-Christ typology has no capacity or conceptual space to recognize. And such recognition, in the sense of the simple incorporation of difference into the typology, I don't think should be a contemporary theological goal. Rather, the Adam-Christ typology, and most especially the particularity of Adam, needs to be kept live in Christian theological anthropology, not as a straightforward resource to be reclaimed, but as a constant witness to the failure of the typology and its afterlives to resolve embodied difference without remainder. And while the typology itself cannot provide the resources we need to think embodied sexual difference differently, its ongoing critical interrogation contributes to the never entirely finished work of ground clearing, thereby creating the possibility of, and indeed necessity, for looking to other sites, historical, textual, and/or conceptual, within the tradition. By keeping this typological failure in view, then, we glimpse, with a clarity that grows sharper as one delves into both the Pauline text and its later Christian appropriations, that the typology's implicit vision of stable masculinity and concomitant pretensions to anthropological universality were always a theological counterfeit. Out of this crisis and the projects of critical interrogation it incites, new modes and dimensions of being an embodied subject that have long been present, if often submerged, may become more easily legible to Christian anthropology. Engendered in the theological fresh air, perhaps in still some complicated sense Pauline, the fresh air of movement and affirmation. Thank you. Yes. So in the footnote, I just cite a couple of places I think are really interesting. Some of Virginia Burris's work on embodiment and late ancient sexuality in hagiography, and then Amy's work on the Beguines. And also, this isn't meant to be like sucking up to HDS people, but it's just work I think is really good. There's a chapter in Mark's book, in Mark Jordan's book on the sodomy book, and it's on Aquinas. And like, not that people who read about Aquinas don't ever read it, but it's this fascinating working through of Aquinas' own system in the Summa for sort of like, what are the unthought thoughts, right, in this system? Where are the places where Thomas turns away and won't go, and yet that we might push from within, the terms of this theological resource to think about embodiment and sexuality differently. So those are just a few places that are not stuff I work on, but that I've found to be really helpful. Larry.
This was really interesting and a bit of an introduction from me for this aspect that I'm not that familiar with, so this may be a bit of a naive question. But one of the things I've wondered about these figures is why they thought they needed Paul, because they could have had a different genealogy. You mentioned Hegel or Heidegger or whatever to address these existentialist issues. But they latched on to Paul, and that sort of surprises me. And if you were there with them at that creative moment, 20 years before they wrote these essays, and they said, "I'm thinking of using Paul," would you have said, "Why?"
A lot of people do.
Yeah. But you're in a position, I think, to really get into that question. Why?
That's a great question. All right, I have a couple thoughts on that. So the simplest answer is that Badiou doesn't start with Paul. He makes the whole argument, he makes a shortened form of the argument with Pascal, actually, right? Like that's where he goes first, and then later he finds Paul. And it's a particular version of Paul that he encounters. It's a Boltzmannian Paul, right? And sort of to my mind, so much of this is coming out of a disillusionment in contemporary philosophy with socialism on the ground, right? There are these critiques of capitalism, but how do you revivify some form of Marxism as a viable social movement with like actual robust intellectual credentials? And there's this sense of dismay and this sense that like we're not going to get there incrementally, right? This is not going to happen gradually. And so how do you think a radically new event, right, that could change everything? Because in a sort of I'm trading in big generalizations here that I would probably, oh, this is going on the internet. Oh, well, whatever. um, you know, in the sort of French milieu, right, post-Saussure and Derrida and language as an interrelated system of differences from which one never gets out of. How do you theorize something absolutely just world transforming? And so Bultmann's Paul, you know, emerges as there's a lot to work with there, right? With that particular way of reading Paul. But then what gets really interesting is a little bit later. By the time Zizek picks all this stuff up, nobody buys Bultmann's Paul anymore, right? And so then Zizek, he's kind of reading the New Perspective stuff and like dealing sort of with the fact that Paul was Jewish and immersed in a world that is a world of interplay, right? Of sameness and difference. And the way in which the New Perspective, of course, highlights that in really concrete historical terms. Zizek is interested in that, but he kind of harnesses it in his whole sort of Hegelian thing so that Judaism is like this, it's absolutely necessary, you have to pass through it, but it's not where we're ending up. I sort of meandered from your question a bit, but yeah. Chip, good to see you.
So I'm as sort of far from a New Testament scholar as one could be, but the passage from Galatians 3:28 sort of stands out, and I can see how it could cut multiple different ways. You know, the point about neither male nor female, slave nor free, and all. And I wondered how that might either reinforce some of the problems that you're talking about, or push in a different direction, given that it, you know, still comes from some of the similar sources you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, for both Badiou and Zizek, that's their go-to passage. That and in 1 Corinthians, the negation stuff, the living as if not, right? And it becomes about negating the particularities of identity. And so, you know, but it's interesting. I didn't get into all these details because it would have been tedious, but even the way Zizek will read Galatians 3:28, at every turn he makes it like more disembodied, right? So he'll quote it and be like, oh, there's all this stuff, but what this is really telling us, he just ignores sexual difference. He says, what this is really telling us is that cultural identification doesn't matter, right? And so if you look in Galatians, right, I mean, this is very viscerally embodied stuff, right? Paul's concerned about bodies. He's concerned about the literal cut of circumcision on a body. And Zizek sort of washes this down, you know, he sort of washes it out to make it kind of blandly about like it's not about race. That's not a category he wants to go anywhere near, right? It's about cultural identification, and this is now irrelevant because in this new militant collective, these differences will have become indifferent. So, and Badiou does something very similar. So that's one thing that's going on with Galatians 3:28. Galatians 3:28 in the ancient stuff is like this incredibly vexed, difficult problem, and it was read in sort of the classic works of feminist biblical studies as a fairly straightforward theological resource, right? But then there was this question about, is this Paul, or is this, you know, a kind of baptismal formula of the radical egalitarianism of the new community, and Paul's just sort of stuck with it, but actually he kind of wishes it weren't there. So that's been one trajectory of thinking about that verse, and then some more recent work in biblical studies has tended towards what do I want to say, a more sort of pessimistic reading of Galatians 3:28, reading it in terms of primal androgyny and these Platonizing traditions that showing how the no male or female is always already masculine in some way, right? And that I would put someone like Clement of Alexandria there, certainly. And then my second book was deeply indebted to that whole conversation around Galatians 3:28, but was trying to suggest that there was a sort of deeper theological logic in play here, that we actually needed to look other places in the Pauline text to try to unpack the complexity of what's going on. Julia.
Hey, Ben. So my question is just sort of, it's more general in the history of sort of both biblical, but also, early Christian thinking about the Christ-Adam typology, is what kinds of distinctions were made between Christ's sinless human body and the resurrected body, and, how important were those taken to be theologically, and whether any of the, the new Paul stuff picks that up.
Christ's sinless human body prior to the resurrection, you mean? Or yeah.
His resurrected body, whether or not there were substantive distinctions there.
They're certainly concerned with those issues. I'm not sure that I'd have to go back and really look at the text, but it's not something that I associate primarily with the discussions around Adam and Christ. And I think that's in large part because Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 don't lend you to putting that fine a point on those distinctions in terms of the problematic of Christ as a human being who is then subsequently transformed and glorified. They're certainly really, really worried about those issues, but the reflections on the Adam and Christ typology tend to be, they're doing a whole first Adam, second Adam thing, right? So if you want to think about anything prior to the resurrection body, in that framework, you look at Genesis, right? And you look at Adam, the first human is born of dust, the second anthropos, the second human is of heaven. Yeah.
I have a question. Is this still on? Okay. I am still reflecting on the last words of your constructive theology project, where you talk about movement and affirmation. The way I hear that is that all definitions are inherently limited, localized from a particular point of view, and are meant to do something, or are meant to intervene in a certain way to bring out something. And so, right, HDS, the pastoral moment of that, allows for, or what I interpret is to call forth the kind of, to allow a disposition of improvision when we come to definitions that allow us to take in a particular moment, not to universalize the situation, but to try to understand what's happening to best intervene in a moment, which I think is beautiful, but I feel like I'm interpreting a lot, uploading a lot into what this movement and affirmation moment is. And I would love to hear more what you think, and how you describe more about this moment of movement and affirmation within your constructive project.
Yeah. No, I like what you just said. I think we need definitions, right? I don't think you can move in the world, in language, as a subject, right, without anthropological definitions of one kind or another. But of course, language is violent, right? Structurally so, right? It sort of constitutively performs these exclusions in ways that are, I don't think that's bad. I think it's just how language works, right? I'm really convinced by the whole sort of trajectory of post-68 French philosophy that has explored this. And so then the question for me becomes how in Christian anthropology might we think differently about bodies and sex and gender and desire and the need to say something, right? And the need to work with definitions, but did you use the word provisional, or did I just come up with that?
Improvisional, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I like that, right? But I've moved in so many Christian contexts in my own life where the notion of improvisation and definition are just seen as fundamentally antithetical to each other, right? You just cannot hold those two together. And so it's this sort of larger problem of, how might we think definition differently, right? And what if we didn't equate definition with final closure when it came to these very vexed anthropological issues? But I also don't. I am not of the school of thought that thinks that we ought to just jettison the whole tradition and, it all sucks, it's all oppressive, it's all violent, so let's just cut it off, let's start over, and let's, kind of do the genderqueer play thing. If you know Dale Martin's book, this is gonna be on the internet. Okay, whatever. Dale and I have thought about this, so it's fine. If you know Dale Martin's book on sex and the Bible, he does this whole kind of thing where he says, there's not really meaning in texts, and history's all constructed, blah blah blah, and so his end game there is to say at a certain point in the book, so let's just be done with this. Like, none of this is relevant anymore. Like, what history can show us is that we can't relate to this, and now we can imagine all our own queer ways of reading Galatians 3:28. And I don't know if I'm more pessimistic or optimistic or what. I'm not sure what it is, but I think that, and that to me is like, something makes me nervous in that move that is analogous to what makes me nervous in Badiou and Zizek, right? Like this notion that you could ever just sort of fully cut off, right, the traditions and modes of thought and conceptual apparatus that we inherit, right, and that haunt us and that do not need to determine everything, like in an overly fixed way, but that if we don't continue to engage critically and in an always ongoing way, I think that stuff goes underground, so to speak, right? Like, it's still operating in there, but in ways that we're not that we're not critically bringing to light and wrestling with. And I have a colleague, a very good friend at Fordham, who read Spectres of Paul and was like, oh yeah, she's a feminist theologian of a different type than me, I guess, but we respect each other a lot, and she said, oh, I love the book, but the one thing I don't get is just why Genesis? She's like, Genesis is an awful text. Like, it's horrible. Let's just get rid of it. Let's just be done with Genesis and let's talk about experience or other categories that we could use out of which to do our theology. And I mean, obviously, I think that human experience is an enormously important, if not uncomplicated, category or factor that needs to be considered in contemporary theology. But my response to her was just, I said, maybe you're different. I don't think I'm ever done with Genesis. Even when I have so many problems with it, it's so much a part of shaping the inheritance of the moment I find myself in theologically. And so I think that we need to continue to wrestle with these texts, problematic as they often are.
For your constructive treatment of this, I'd like to present an issue from recent history, or a decade or two ago, of Harvard Divinity School. We had a very famous case of a professor in a leading position here who was demoted by the president of Harvard for having pornography on a Harvard computer. And the president didn't say to him, get it off the computer, get your own computer, why don't you go to a marriage counseling course and maybe do some research and talk about views of sexuality in Christian history. It wasn't used as an opportunity for discovery and teaching. It was used as an opportunity for, I thought, as an alumnus who's lived a block away for 50 years, 1636 Puritanism is alive and well at Harvard. My question is, if you were president of Harvard, how would you have handled it? So you're president of Harvard for a moment. That's our gift to you.
This is going on the internet. All right. It's a great question. I don't know if I can say anything halfway intelligent. I'm also very aware of that particular case. I think everybody was. I don't know how I would have handled that as the president of Harvard. I think that issues of sex and desire and embodiment and difference are incredibly difficult. I think they are some of the most difficult questions that the Christian theological tradition or any tradition has to attend to. And my concern in both folks like Badu and Zizek, and also in work of someone like Richard Hayes and frankly John Paul II, and I have a whole thing on him in the book as well, is that these incredibly vexed, difficult questions are treated as if they are not difficult, right? And that as if we have these very clean, very coherent answers that do not require any kind of prudential judgment of any sort, which obviously the case you're referring to would be, that's what you need, right? But that what's presented instead is that there is this anthropological system, and it's tight, and everybody knows, you can see where you fit, and that then prescribes ways of being in the world. And you know, I guess for a lot of people that works, but for those of us who find our own experience of being embodied and our own structures of desire as illegible within that system, you know, I think it's a deep impoverishment of Christian theology. And so, I mean, really what I would give pride of place to, I didn't mention this in the talk, is the experience of intersex and transgendered people who are experiencing ways of being in the world that confound the terms of this system, right? And you read the stuff in JP2 and Theology of the Body, and I mean, it just has like no capacity for any kind of anthropological recognition that would humanize these non-normative ways of being. And so one thing that my work, I see it as really being about, is not letting these arguments that tend to just sort of assume the coherence of the system. It's just like, here's the system, it's coherent, here's what it means, here's how it works. Now we can get on to talking about who gets to live in what ways. And the system is not coherent. And it was not coherent historically, and it is not coherent now. And that is where I think it's scary things happen when Christian theology loses sight of that. And so that's not really an answer to your question, but I think that I would hope that work like this would open up a certain kind of intellectual and spiritual space in a community like Harvard Divinity School for people in leadership roles who have to make extremely difficult decisions to exercise prudential judgment, right? And to wrestle with the difficulty of these issues in ways that don't trivialize them. So.
Thank you.